Praise be to God's holy name. By the grace of God, we are now in the Epistle of Paul to the Romans. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Romans from the Greek city of Corinth in AD 57, just 3 years after the 16-year-old Nero ascended the throne as the Emperor of Rome. The persecution of the Christians began after the Great Fire in AD 64. Therefore, Paul wrote to a church that was experiencing a time of relevant peace. But Paul felt that the church needed a strong dose of basic gospel doctrine. Paul had not gone to Rome when he wrote the letter, but he clearly expressed his desire to travel there in the near future. Romans chapter 1, verse 10 to 12. Paul used a man named Tertus to transcribe his words. And this we read in Romans chapter 16, verse 22. This letter was written by Paul to those who were loved by God and called to be saints. Romans chapter 1, verse 7. This is the longest letter Paul wrote. The theme of this letter is righteousness. It tells about Jesus and what he has accomplished. The book of Romans is primarily a work of doctrine and can be divided into 4 sections. In chapter 1 to chapter 3, we see the need for man's righteousness. In chapter 3 to chapter 8, we see God's provision of righteousness. In chapter 9 to chapter 11, we see man's rejection of righteousness. And finally, in chapter 12 to chapter 15, we see the practicing of righteousness. And with this note, let us move on to chapter 1. And today's scripture portion for our meditation is Romans chapter 1. In this chapter, we find the human race which is guilty before God. An overview of the chapter. Verse 1 to verse 7 is Paul introducing the chapter. Verse 8 to verse 15 is thanksgiving and prayers for the Roman Christians. Verse 16 and 17 is about the power of the gospel. And verse 18 to verse 20 is about the guilt of the Gentiles. Verse 21 to verse 23 is about the stages of apostasy, the sins that defile the body. Verse 24 to verse 28, the results of apostasy. And finally, verse 29 to verse 32, it's about the sins which damn the soul and which brings God's judgment. The life and ministry of Paul is well documented in Acts chapter 8 through chapter 28, as well as in Galatians chapter 1 and 2 and 2 Corinthians chapters 11 and 12. When Paul wrote the book of Romans, he had been a Christian preacher for about 20 years. On his way to Jerusalem, he had 3 months in Corinth when he wrote to the Christians in Rome, a church he planned to visit after the trip to Jerusalem. The letter of Romans focuses more on God and his great plan of redemption. Paul's self identification is important. He begins by giving his own credentials. He is first a born servant of Jesus Christ, and second, he is called to be an apostle. He is separated to bring the gospel of God. He is being set apart by God for the task he was to do before he was born, according to Galatians chapter 1, verse 15. When Paul calls himself as the slave of Jesus Christ, he is setting himself in succession of the prophets. Their greatness and glory lay in the fact that they were slaves of God, and so did his. So then, a slave of Jesus Christ is one who has the obligation of a great love and the honor of a great office. Paul did not think of life in terms of what he wanted to do, but in terms of what God meant him to do. For every man, God has a plan. No man's life is purposeless. God sends man into the world in order to do some definite thing. In verse 2 to verse 11, Paul introduces his gospel to the Romans. Besides giving his own credentials, Paul in this passage sets out the most essential outline, the gospel which he preached. It was a gospel which centered in Jesus Christ. In particular, it was a gospel of the incarnation and resurrection. His uniqueness is guaranteed forever by the fact of the resurrection. Jesus lives on and gives us a presence still mighty with power. Jesus Christ is the center of Paul's gospel. This Jesus has both a human origin, born of the seed of David, and an eternal existence, declared to be the Son of God. The evidence of Jesus' humanity is his human birth. The evidence of his deity is his resurrection from the dead. The gospel gave Paul and the church grace and apostleship, and the reason why these two gifts were given was to produce obedience to the faith. The gospel has to go to all nations and create impact, and now it has reached the Roman Christians. Verse 8 to verse 15. Paul expresses his desire to come to Rome. In verse 7, Paul is addressing the Christians in Rome as the beloved of God and called to be saints. He was thankful for the good reputation of the church in Rome. Although Paul did not know the people at Rome personally, he nevertheless constantly prayed to God for them. Paul's desire to visit the church in Rome was not merely to give to them some spiritual gift, but to receive as well. He also wanted to take some fruits from among the people. He was also ready to preach and serve. Verse 16 and 17. Paul here introduces the theme of his letter, the righteousness of God as revealed in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Paul was not ashamed to preach the gospel of Christ in a sophisticated city like Rome. He is not ashamed because the gospel is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes. The Roman world of Paul's day looked for salvation. The gospel's power of salvation comes to everyone who believes, both the Jew and the Gentile. This Christian salvation denotes many things. It is salvation from physical illness, it is salvation from danger, and it is salvation from sin. Men are like slaves or on bondage, and they cannot escape from it. The Christian salvation liberates them from the tyranny of sin. The gospel reveals the righteousness of God. This revelation of God's righteousness comes to those with faith. The just shall live by faith. There is the conception of justification. What does justification mean? It means that God reckons us not as his enemies, but as his friends, not as bad men who deserve punishment, but as good men, not as lawbreakers to be punished, but as men and women to be loved. That is the very essence of the gospel. Jesus enables men and women to enter into the new and precious relationship with God. Fear was gone, and love had come to the person who had been justified by Jesus, by the amazing mercy and love of God. Because of it, man who was an enemy earlier has now become his friend. Verse 18 to verse 20. It talks about the guilt of the Gentiles. In the previous passage, Paul was thinking about the relationship with God into which a man can enter through the faith when the person yields to his faith and trust. In contrast with that, he sets the wrath of God which a man must incur if he is deliberately blind to God and worships his own thoughts and idols instead of Jesus. In the Old Testament, the wrath of God was poured on the children of Israel who broke their covenant with God. And this we read in the book of Numbers, chapter 16 and 25. In the age of the prophets, the idea of the wrath of God was poured out during the two ages, the present age and the age to come, which are separated by the day of the Lord. The wrath of God is mentioned in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 9, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 19. Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 19 speaks of the day of the wrath of the Lord, and God will pour out upon his nation. And in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 8, we read that God will pour out upon the nations his indignation and all the heat of his anger. Paul speaks of the wrath of God coming upon the children of disobedience. But Jesus delivered us from the wrath to come. The greatest peril facing the human race is the wrath of God from heaven. The wrath of God is against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Ungodliness refers to man's offenses against God, and unrighteousness refers to the sins of man against man. Mankind does, in fact, suppress the truth of God, and God shows us something of his eternal power and divine nature through creation and by the things that are made. But when man breaks the law of nature, he suffers physically and spiritually. Verse 21 to verse 23. Now, Paul talks about the stages of apostasy. Though man is aware of the power of God, he refused to glorify God and refused to be thankful to God. Man has changed the incorruptible God into an image of their own choice. The rejection of God had made them fools, and their hearts are darkened. Man, instead of looking out to God, he looked unto himself. He was a fool because he made his ideas, his opinions, and his speculations the standard and the law of life. He lived in a self centered world instead of a God centered world. He started looking at himself, and the result was idolatry. The root sin of idolatry is that it is selfish. His worship is for his own sake and not for God's. In this passage, we see that the essence of sin is to put self in the place of God. Verse 24 to verse 28. Paul talks about the tragic result of human guilt. God, in his righteous wrath and judgment, gave man up to the sin of his evil heart's desire. God gave man free will, and he respects that free will. Paul speaks of God abandoning man to uncleanness. There is no condemnation or judgment on the part of God, but just abandonment. But just abandoned him from being his choice. The most terrible thing about sin is just its power to beget sin. The truth of God was exchanged for the lie of man's own choice of a creature before the Creator. God gave them up to sexual immorality and vile affections. Instead of the healthy relationship, they indulged in unholy sexual acts and homosexuality. Paul speaks of a penalty for homosexual conduct. Our rebellion against God is not only displayed in our action, but in our thinking also. God gave them over to a reprobate mind. Verse 29 to verse 32 speaks about an age of shame, an age when things seemed as it were out of control. It is an age of unparalleled luxury. It's an age of unparalleled immorality. This passage shows what happens to a man when he leaves God out of his life. He becomes a kind of man doing all dreadful things which make him enter into the godless life. The sins that damn a man's soul are listed here. They are unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, unplacable, unmerciful, and so on. God's judgment comes upon them. Those who practice or approve of these things are worthy of death. Coming to the end of the chapter, we find that this chapter offers insight into how we shall live in the modern world. First, we should not be ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. Secondly, the just shall live by faith. The chapter ends with God's judgment on those who commit sins with the full knowledge of their actions. So, in this chapter, Paul has emphasized on the need of righteousness, and an unrighteous man would face eternal death. Amen.